Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to This Explainer. Have you ever wondered why economic debates just always seem to feel so messy? You turn on the news, and one expert is shouting that a new policy will save the middle class, while another expert, with the exact same credentials, mind you, insists it's going to completely destroy the economy. It feels confusing and totally chaotic, doesn't it? Well, if you feel that way, you are certainly not alone.
Today, we're going to demystify exactly how economists actually analyze the world and make their policy recommendations. We want to give you a mental framework, a new pair of glasses, if you will, to see through all that noise. And we'll do that by understanding the absolutely critical difference between positive and normative economics, or as we like to call them, the scientist and the advisor.
Okay, let's dive straight into this. We're going to cover the two main branches, look at our scientist and our advisor, compare fact versus opinion, run a quick minimum wage test, and then see why we actually need both.
All right, first up, splitting the discipline into two branches.
Let's start with our first character, positive economics, aka the scientist.
The foundational concept here is that if we want to make any sense of policy recommendations, we absolutely have to divide economic thought into two distinct branches. Otherwise, it's just a giant jumbled mess of math and opinions. So when economists put on this first hat, they're looking at the world through a highly factual, measured, and objective lens. Positive economics is the branch that relies on objective data, facts, and cause and effect relationships to observe how the economy actually works. It's the what is. This branch is strictly concerned with developing and testing economic theories. When acting as the scientist, the economists leave their personal values, their ethics, and their moral judgments completely out the door.
Now here's a kind of counterintuitive fact that surprises a lot of people. A positive statement doesn't actually have to be correct, it just has to be testable. Think about the claim, cutting taxes will reduce economic growth. Actually, that statement might be completely false in a given scenario, but it is still a positive statement because we can go out, gather the data, and test it against reality. If you can prove it true or false, it's positive.
And this brilliantly illustrates how economists actually do the heavy lifting here. They use objective mathematical models, like, stating that quantity demanded is a function of price. They test historical data to see if, say, printing more money in the past actually led to inflation. And they focus on measurable statistics, like observing if a 10% increase in the minimum wage actually causes a 2% rise in teenage unemployment. It's all about the math and the hard data.
Moving on to our second character, normative economics, or the advisor.
Now, when economists swap hats and put this one on, they become way more passionate and value-driven. Normative economics is the subjective, value-based branch. It brings in opinions, ethical considerations, and judgments about fairness and equity. It's all about the what ought to be. And unlike those positive statements we just talked about, these normative statements are completely untestable. I mean, you can't scientifically prove that something is fair using a spreadsheet, right? Fairness is based on ideological perspectives. And honestly, this subjectivity is exactly why economic policy debates get so heated and messy.
So, how do you spot a normative statement out in the wild? Well, you got to watch out for some specific trigger words. The next time you're reading an article or watching a debate, pay close attention. Are they telling you what will happen, or are they using words like should, ought, must, fair, or better? If someone says the government should increase taxes to reduce inequality, or healthcare ought to be free, they aren't giving you science anymore, they're giving you a subjective normative claim.
All right, let's put these two side by side to look at fact versus opinion. Looking at this comparison really locks in the differences for us. Notice the focus. Positive is purely descriptive. It describes what is, while normative is prescriptive, prescribing what ought to be. Positive is objective and scientific. Normative is totally subjective and opinionated. The absolute biggest dividing line here is testability. Only positive economics can actually be verified with data. And ultimately, their roles in policy are super distinct. Positive economics explains the factual consequences of a policy, but normative economics recommends which policy we should adopt in the first place.
Let's put this theory into practice with a minimum wage test.
All right, let's bring both of our characters together in a real-world laboratory experiment, the labor market. Now, what's really interesting here is seeing pure positive economics at work. Look at that downward-sloping labor demand curve and the upward-sloping labor supply curve. It traces a completely objective reality. At a wage of 10, the market naturally clears at an equilibrium of 100 units of labor. No opinions here, just a factual observation of cause and effect.
But then, in walks the advisor. Notice the new green horizontal line. A policymaker steps in with a normative goal. They look at that $10 wage and say, nope, that's too low. Workers deserve a living wage. So they make a value-based judgment to intervene and set the minimum wage to 14. That green line, that is driven entirely by ethics and opinions on fairness.
And here is exactly where the two branches collide. Once that normative policy is put into place, positive economics steps right back in to measure the actual results. If you follow that green line across, you'll see that at a wage of 14, suddenly 140 workers want jobs. But businesses, they only demand 80 workers at that new, higher price point.
So the objective consequence of that well-intentioned policy is an unemployment gap, a surplus of labor of exactly 60 workers. The normative goal was absolutely to help workers, but the positive reality is that 60 people who really want to work at that new wage simply cannot find a job. Which brings us to our final point, a necessary marriage, and why both of these branches actually matter.
After seeing that little experiment, you might be tempted to think one branch is better, or maybe more important than the other. But that's simply not true. They rely entirely on one another. So the crucial point is that good economic policy requires a marriage of both branches. A policymaker absolutely needs normative economics to set a societal goal, like saying we should reduce poverty or we must protect the environment. Because let's face it, a society without values isn't much of a society at all. But once that goal is set, they have to use positive economics to choose the right tools and accurately measure the side effects, making sure they aren't causing unintended harm.
This framework can fundamentally change how you consume information. The next time you see a news headline announcing a new tax, a new tariff, or some new subsidy, ask yourself, what normative goals are driving today's positive policies? And are the policymakers honestly measuring the positive consequences, or are they just repeating their normative wishes? Keep those questions in mind, and the messy world of economic debates will suddenly become crystal clear. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.